Please be aware, in this podcast series we talk about all areas of safeguarding, which some people may find upsetting. So please make sure you're okay listening to today's topic. Be mindful of those around you, such as children, that you might not want to listen in. Hi, I'm SSS Safeguarding Director Sam Preston.
And I'm former head teacher and content author Sara Spinks.
Hello and welcome to Safeguarding Conversations. Today we've scheduled an additional podcast, and that's because we're looking at a topic that's generated quite a few questions from schools recently, and that's the use of spare adrenaline auto-injectors or AAIs following the latest government guidance.
That's right. Severe allergic reactions, including anaphylaxis, can happen very quickly. So it's essential that schools understand exactly when and how spare AAIs can be used.
So let's start with what has changed. So schools can legally purchase spare AAIs without the need for a prescription for emergency use. The Department of Education Guidance, Allergy Safety in Schools, published this month, expects that all schools will stock spare adrenaline devices of the correct dosage for their pupils for use in emergency situations. The government intends to introduce a statutory duty requiring schools to do this, to stock the spare adrenaline devices for use in emergency situations through forthcoming regulations. So schools really need to organise this now. There's also a separate Department of Health and Social Care guidance that explains the minimum number of devices and which strengths of dosage, schools should keep.
One phrase in the guidance that's caused some confusion, though, the words without prescription. Some people have interpreted that as meaning the spare device can simply be used on anyone. But that's not exactly what it means, is it, Sam?
This term doesn't. What the without prescription is applying to is it's basically saying, quite simply, schools don't need a doctor's prescription to buy spare devices because they're not being purchased for a named pupil.
So who can the spare AAIs actually be used for then?
So under normal circumstances, it can only be given to a pupil who is already known to be at risk of anaphylaxis, has medical authorisation, has written parental consent for the school to use the spare device, and whose own prescribed AAI can't be used. So it's avoiding that delay.
And there's some confusion that, those situations where it might happen, aren't there? There's the confusion of those, and there's some obvious situations, though, I think, where this might happen. Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, for example, the pupil's own pen, maybe they can't locate it. It might have gone out of date, or the device itself has malfunctioned. So when you use one of these auto-injectors, once you press firmly the device into the upper outer thigh, there is a noise, but it's quite difficult sometimes to hear that just because, usually there's a lot going on. You hold it in for the recommended amount of time. When you pull it out, the needle is then revealed. You can see that it is actually fired the needle down. Now, if you take the device out and the needle's not there, that means the device has not fired. Therefore, the medication has not been administered. So, it is quite rare, but it can happen. And we can't prevent there is a possibility of a faulty injector. So that's where, having a spare pen would be useful. The other examples, having gone out of date or they can't find the pen, those examples are absolutely, they are avoidable. So schools should have robust systems to make sure the pupil's prescribed medication is always in date. So checking those dates termly. So that's like getting the medication out and checking the expiry dates. And then ensuring that each pupil's AAI is always readily accessible wherever they are on site. Now, there's another important point here about dosage too. So the spare pen should be the same strength, the same dosage as the pupil's prescribed AAI. Usually, auto-injectors come in 2 dosage prescriptions. So schools should make sure that they hold the appropriate doses for the children in their care. So if you've got some children, which would be younger children, because dosage is actually based on weight, some children may be prescribed 150 milligram dosages. Older children may be prescribed 300 milligram doses. So it's important that the spares held in school, that if you've got children, older children, or you've got children that have been prescribed the higher dosage, that you have those spares in place as well.
Now, here's where many schools have been asking questions.
Yeah.
What if a child has what appears to be their first ever severe allergic reaction? They've never been prescribed an AAI, there's no parental consent on file, but they're probably showing signs of anaphylaxis.
Well, the guidance is very clear, and I've had a few queries on this week as well. I had a query that said, how would I know which dose of the spare pen to give, because I don't know the weight of the child? And that led me to think, oh, hang on a minute, people are misinterpreting this. The guidance is very clear. If it's a first event, what we call a first event, so that you think that this is anaphylaxis, the first action is you're straight on the phone, you're calling 999 immediately, and you're saying, I've got a child, I think they're having an anaphylactic episode. The advice will then come from the emergency services about whether the spare AAI should be administered, and they will tell you which one to use. They'll ask a series of questions to determine which dosage pen that they should be given.
So for a child who's not known to have anaphylaxis and is not prescribed and has not, has no parental consent, but you think it might be their first ever, the emergency call must come first.
It comes first, exactly. But the guidance also does recognise that emergencies, they aren't always straightforward. So that's where the Human Medicines Amendment Regulations of 2017 come in. Because if it isn't possible to obtain advice from the emergency services, the legislation allows a spare AAI to be used in a genuine emergency without prior parental consent. The law recognises that in life-threatening situations, people should be able to take reasonable action to save a life without unnecessary delay.
And I think that's a really important distinction.
Yeah.
It's not a routine use of a spare device. It's an emergency decision made to protect life when immediate medical advice isn't available.
That's in a first event response we're talking about. I just need to be really clear about that, where it's not known, but you think it may be. And, I would have to say, you may be in a situation where it isn't possible. I mean, when you're on the school site, it's, you can get through to emergency services. There may be situations where you can't. And it's just about being reassured that you don't want to be in a position where you are thinking, I can't get advice from anybody, but I really think that this is what it is. I've done the training, I've seen this is what it looks like. Should I give it? Should I not? You are, for want of a better phrase, you are covered by the Human Medicines Amendment Regulations. So schools should make sure all staff, not just first aiders, that they understand these arrangements. Everyone should know where the spare AAIs are stored, because in an anaphylactic emergency, every minute counts. We don't want to be sending people off to find other people who know where the pens are.
And also, I think, policies need reviewing, don't they?
Absolutely.
They should explain when spare AAIs may be used, who they may be used for, the procedures for first ever reactions that we've just talked about, staff training requirements, and how medication is monitored and replaced before expiry.
Yeah, I mean, I foresee that some schools may decide on school entry, when you're signing on, the parents sign all the things that they agree to. Schools may add something in there that says, if your child has a first event of a severe allergy or we suspect it's anaphylaxis, that you consent to us using the spare pen.
Yes,
You know,
that's a really good idea. I like that.
I think this is all very new, and I think as we blend all of these things into our policy, our procedures as well will follow on from
Yes.
that. So I think possibly, I know certainly if it was me, I would probably put something in my admission policy, and I
That's
would
a
put
really good
something
idea.
in the bit that parents sign to say that they consent to it.
Yeah.
The other area to think about is educational visits. They need some thought. So at the moment, we're very, very good with children who are known to have these severe reactions. You know, their pens accompany them, and we always make sure that there's at least one person on the trip who's equipped to administer it should it be needed. But we also need to think about, well, where do spare pens fit in here? And, you know, first events, it's made us really think about that. So schools should consider whether a spare AAI should accompany educational visits. I would say they absolutely should, especially residential visits, where there's maybe access to emergency services. They may take longer, or they may in fact not be possible at all. I mean, I can think of several educational visits I've done in the past with children and residentials where phone reception was at best intermittent.
Yeah.
It's equally important, though, that taking a spare device off site, that it doesn't leave the school itself without appropriate emergency provision. And in fact, the guidance clearly states this, that the core stock of pens usually held by a school should not be affected by an educational visit. So what that's saying is, if you decide you need, say, 6 pens to be held as your spare pens in school, you can't take 2 of them to go on an educational visit and leave the school with 4. If you've assessed the risk as 6, that minimum level has to be maintained. So you would be saying you need an additional pens.
Yeah. You need additional over what you think you need for your school.
Absolutely.
So, Sam, what are the key takeaways from this?
Well, I would summarise them really, I suppose, like this. Schools now, they can purchase spare AAIs without a prescription, which is really, really beneficial. Routine use of a spare AAI is only for eligible pupils who already have medical authorisation and parental consent where their own prescribed device can't be used. So that is the routine, what we'd call the routine use of spares. For suspected first episode of anaphylaxis, you're calling 999 immediately and seeking emergency advice, and they will direct you as to whether to use the pen and what dosage to use. If emergency advice genuinely cannot be obtained, the law allows reasonable action to save life. So that's including using the spare AAI without prior consent. And finally, staff training. That's a mandatory requirement now for all staff. You need clear policies and knowing where spare devices are kept. These are all essential.
So ultimately, this is about balancing legal compliance with, with the real rapid emergency action when a child's life may be at risk.
Exactly, Sarah. It's about determining best practice, assessing risk and planning. And there is going to have to be some planning into this because the guidance says that pens should be ideally no more than 5 minutes away from where a child could be. Now, just imagine a secondary school site where you might have multiple buildings.
Yeah.
And indeed primaries, our primary schools are getting bigger. Schools are going to have to give this some careful planning and assessing that risk. Clear understanding of the guidance helps staff to act confidently, appropriately, and without hesitation in situations where timely action is essential. So I hope we've managed to clarify some of the confusion that's arisen. We've more information available on our website where you can also access our allergy and anaphylaxis staff training. So if you haven't got your staff trained yet, you can access our online training there. So all that remains is to thank you for listening. We are taking a short break for the summer, but the Safeguarding Conversations podcast will return and we'll be back at the end of August. So please do join us again then. Thanks for listening.